For centuries, the familiar image of power in Europe was a king. A king had a palace, an army, a crown, a territory marked on a map. And if you wanted to understand why a country became powerful, the obvious place to look was at its rulers. Then, in the 17th century, something unusual happened. A small republic on the edge of the North Sea became one of the richest and most commercially powerful societies on Earth. It did not have the population of France. It did not have the vast territory of Spain. It did not possess the mineral wealth of an empire like Portugal's. And yet, Dutch ships appeared in the Baltic, the Mediterranean, West Africa, the Caribbean, India, Southeast Asia, and East Asia. Amsterdam became a center of international trade and finance. Dutch merchants handled grain, timber, fish, spices, sugar, textiles, metals, and countless other commodities. And investors could buy shares in a company whose ships were sailing thousands of miles away. This is usually told as the story of the Dutch Golden Age, a story of ships, merchants, the Dutch East India Company, Rembrandt, Amsterdam, and global trade. All of that is true, but it leaves out the most interesting part. The Dutch did not simply become rich because they traded. Trade itself had to be made cheap. It had to be financed, insured, protected, recorded, taxed, and connected to markets. The Dutch achievement was not merely that they sailed farther. It was that they built a system in which money, information, ships, warehouses, credit, government, and military power could reinforce one another. And that creates the central contradiction of the Dutch story. How could a country with relatively little land and a relatively small population become a commercial giant? And if its power depended so heavily on trade, what happened when other countries learned to compete with it? Because the Dutch economy had an extraordinary strength, but that strength carried a hidden weakness. The same system that allowed the Dutch to become Europe's commercial middleman eventually created a world in which England and France could use larger populations, larger states, and increasingly powerful navies to challenge the Dutch at their own game. To understand why this happened, we have to go back before the famous Dutch Golden Age, not to the great voyages of the 17th century, not even to the creation of the Dutch East India Company. We have to go back to the geography of Northern Europe. The Netherlands were not naturally positioned to become a great land empire. Much of the region was low-lying. Water was everywhere. The North Sea was dangerous. The land had to be drained and defended. But this geography also created something valuable: connections. Rivers ran into the interior of Europe. The North Sea connected the Dutch coast to England, France, and Scandinavia. And beyond the Danish Straits lay the Baltic. The Baltic was enormously important because Northern and Eastern Europe supplied commodities that Western European cities needed: grain, timber, naval stores, hemp, flax, and other raw materials. Dutch merchants and shippers became deeply involved in moving these goods. The Baltic trade eventually became so important that the Dutch called it the mother trade. The phrase matters because it reveals something that is often missing from stories about the Dutch Empire. The Dutch economy was not built first on exotic spices from Asia. It was built on ordinary necessities: food, raw materials, shipping, transport, the unglamorous business of moving things from places where they were abundant to places where they were expensive. Amsterdam became a major entrepot, a place where goods arrived, were stored, financed, insured, processed, and redistributed. And that was the first great Dutch advantage. They did not always need to produce the goods themselves. They could make money from controlling the movement. Imagine two countries. One has grain, another has a city that needs grain. A third region has ships. A fourth has merchants with access to credit. The Dutch advantage was increasingly the ability to connect all four. That sounds simple. It wasn't. Transport was expensive. Ships could be lost. Cargo could spoil. Wars could close ports. Pirates could attack. Currencies differed. Merchants needed credit. Buyers could disappear. And information traveled at the speed of a ship. Every one of those problems created a cost. The Dutch commercial system became powerful partly because it became exceptionally good at reducing those costs. That is the deeper story. Trade was not simply about buying low and selling high. It was about reducing the friction between two markets, and the people who reduced that friction could become richer than the people who produced the goods. This is where geography began turning into economic power. Dutch ships became carriers for other people's economies. Dutch merchants developed relationships across Europe. Amsterdam became a place where goods from one region could be exchanged for goods from another. And once that network existed, it created a powerful feedback loop. More ships brought more goods. More goods attracted more merchants. More merchants created more information. More information made trading easier. Easier trading attracted more capital. More capital financed more ships, and more ships strengthened the network. The important point is that the Dutch did not build this system from nothing. They inherited centuries of commercial development in the Low Countries. The southern Netherlands, particularly Flanders and Brabant, had already been major centers of European commerce and manufacturing. Then the political crisis of the 16th century changed the geography of economic power. The Dutch revolt against Spanish rule divided the Low Countries. In 1585, Antwerp fell to Spanish forces. The consequences were enormous. Merchants, artisans, and skilled workers moved north. Capital moved. Knowledge moved. Commercial relationships moved. Amsterdam benefited from this redistribution. Historians disagree about exactly how much of the Dutch economic transformation should be credited to migration from the south and how much came from developments already underway in Holland and Zeeland. But the timing is difficult to ignore. During the 1590s, the Dutch economy experienced a remarkable transformation. Trade expanded, processing industries grew, commercial networks widened, and the northern provinces increasingly became the center of a new European economic system. Then came another crucial development. The Dutch did not merely want to carry goods, they wanted to organize the entire transaction. This required money. And early modern Europe had a serious money problem. There were enormous numbers of coins circulating. Different regions used different currencies. Coins varied in weight and purity. Some were clipped, some were debased. A merchant might sell a cargo in one currency, owe money in another, and receive payment in a third. For a large international trading system, this was more than an inconvenience. It was friction. So Amsterdam created an institution designed to reduce it. In 1609, the city established the Amsterdam Wissel Bank, or Exchange Bank. Merchants could deposit different kinds of coin and conduct payments through accounts. The bank helped standardize payments and settle international debts. It was not a modern central bank in the full contemporary sense, but it became a critical financial institution for Amsterdam's commercial economy. Instead of constantly moving physical coins around, merchants could transfer balances. That meant something very important. Trade could increasingly become an accounting system. A ship did not always need to carry the money for every transaction. The records could move instead. And then the Dutch did something even more consequential. They changed how large-scale commercial ventures could be financed. In 1602, the Dutch Republic created the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC. Its purpose was to consolidate competing Dutch ventures trading to Asia, but its structure mattered as much as its destination. Instead of financing every voyage as a completely separate expedition, capital could be committed to a continuing company. Investors could subscribe to shares. The initial subscription raised roughly 6.5 million guilders, with 1,143 investors subscribing to the Amsterdam Chamber alone. That changed the relationship between commerce and capital. Before this, financing a long-distance voyage could resemble a high-risk partnership. A ship sailed. Investors waited. If it returned with profitable cargo, they gained. If it disappeared, the investment could disappear with it. The VOC created something different. Capital could remain invested in an ongoing enterprise. Shares could be transferred. Ownership could change without dissolving the company, and an investor did not necessarily need to sail anywhere. Money could participate in global commerce from Amsterdam. This was one of the foundations of the Dutch merchant economy. Capital no longer had to follow the ship physically. It could sit in a city while the ship crossed the world. And that created an entirely new kind of leverage. A merchant economy could mobilize savings from people who would never personally travel to Asia. But there was another side to the VOC that is impossible to ignore. This was not free trade in the modern sense. The Dutch state granted the company a monopoly over Dutch trade in a huge area. The VOC could negotiate treaties, build forts, maintain armed forces, conduct military operations, and establish control over territory. In other words, the boundary between commerce and warfare was extremely thin. The Dutch did not simply arrive in Asia and ask whether local producers would like to sell them spices. The company used coercion to establish and defend monopolies. Its pursuit of control over the spice trade could involve violence against communities that resisted Dutch demands. The famous commercial machine therefore depended partly on military power. This creates another contradiction. The Dutch economy looked like a triumph of private enterprise, but private enterprise was backed by public authority, and public authority was increasingly dependent on commercial wealth. The merchant did not replace the state. The merchant and the state became intertwined. That distinction is crucial. The Dutch Republic was not a country without government. It was a decentralized republic of provinces and cities with powerful urban regents and competing political institutions. Its political structure was complicated, but compared with Europe's great centralized monarchies, an unusual amount of political influence was concentrated in wealthy urban elites. Commercial interests had enormous importance, and when war threatened trade, protecting commerce became a matter of national survival. This was especially obvious in the career of Johan de Witt. De Witt was not a king, he was not a merchant captain. He was the Grand Pensionary of Holland and one of the most important political figures in the Dutch Republic during the mid-17th century. His political world was closely connected to the interests of Holland's wealthy urban regents, and under his leadership, the Republic tried to manage an increasingly difficult problem. How do you remain commercially dominant when the countries around you are becoming stronger? Because the Dutch had succeeded partly by becoming extraordinarily efficient. But efficiency is not the same thing as permanent superiority. The English were developing their own maritime system. The French monarchy possessed enormous demographic resources. Spain remained a major imperial power, and all of these states could see what Dutch commercial success meant. The Dutch were proving that wealth could come from controlling trade. Other states wanted the same advantage. This is where the Dutch story becomes a story about imitation. The Dutch had built a system around carrying goods. Other countries began building policies designed to reduce their dependence on Dutch carriers. England was especially important. The English Navigation Acts were designed in part to strengthen English shipping and reduce the role of foreign carriers, particularly the Dutch, in English trade. This was not simply an economic disagreement, it was strategic competition. If Dutch ships carried English goods, Dutch merchants earned income. If English ships carried those goods instead, England gained ships, sailors, commercial experience, and profits. Shipping itself became a strategic asset. That is why the Anglo-Dutch Wars were not simply wars over territory. They were conflicts over the economic architecture of European trade. And here we encounter the hidden mechanism behind Dutch power. The Dutch Republic was wealthy because commerce was highly integrated into its economy. But that meant the country's prosperity depended heavily on maintaining access to commercial networks. A land empire could sometimes lose a port and still survive. A merchant republic could not treat trade disruption as a minor inconvenience. Trade was infrastructure. Trade was employment. Trade was tax revenue. Trade was credit. Trade was food. Trade was naval power, and naval power protected trade. The system fed itself, until the system became too expensive to defend. There was another reason the Dutch economy was so powerful. It was not merely foreign trade. The Dutch developed an extraordinarily productive domestic economy around it. Shipbuilding, fishing, food processing, textiles, brewing, sugar refining, paper, tobacco processing, warehousing, insurance, finance. The commercial network created demand for services and manufacturing. Amsterdam's merchants were not simply moving cargo from one port to another. They were creating an ecosystem around the cargo. And the Baltic grain trade demonstrates this perfectly. Grain arrived in Amsterdam. It could be stored, financed, processed, and redistributed. The Dutch economy therefore made money not only when a commodity was bought and sold, but at multiple points in the journey. Transport, storage, insurance, credit, processing, wholesale, retail. Every layer could generate income. That is why the phrase merchant economy can be misleading if it makes the system sound like a collection of individual traders. It was much larger. It was an economic infrastructure. And at its height, that infrastructure produced spectacular prosperity. Amsterdam expanded. Canals were constructed. Warehouses lined the waterfront. Merchant houses rose along the canals. Paintings captured an increasingly wealthy urban society. Dutch ships crossed oceans. Financial markets became sophisticated, and the Republic became one of the richest societies in Europe. But prosperity creates a dangerous illusion. When a system works extremely well, people begin to assume that its success is permanent, and the Dutch system was about to encounter a problem that money alone could not solve: scale. The Dutch Republic was small. Its population was limited compared with France and, increasingly, England. That had advantages. A concentrated commercial population could be highly productive, but it also imposed limits. The Dutch could not easily match the manpower available to larger states. They could hire soldiers. They could finance fleets. They could lend money. But there were limits to how far a small population could stretch itself, and wars became increasingly expensive. This became painfully clear in 1672, the year later remembered in Dutch history as the rampjaar, the disaster year. The Republic was attacked by multiple enemies. French armies advanced into Dutch territory. The political and military crisis was severe. For a country whose prosperity depended on stability and commerce, this was almost the nightmare scenario. The response was not simply economic. The Dutch flooded parts of the country to create defensive water lines. The navy remained essential, and Johan de Witt's political career collapsed. He and his brother Cornelis were murdered by a mob in The Hague. The crisis brought William III of Orange to the center of Dutch politics. The old merchant regent order did not disappear overnight, nor did Dutch commercial power. In fact, the Republic survived. That matters. The disaster year did not instantly destroy the Dutch economy. The Dutch adapted. They fought. They formed alliances. They continued to finance warfare, and Dutch naval power remained formidable. So if the Dutch survived 1672, why did their relative dominance eventually weaken? Because the deeper problem was not one invasion. It was competition. The Dutch had pioneered a commercial model that other states could copy, and larger states could add something the Dutch did not possess in equal measure: scale. England's population was growing. France's population was vastly larger. Both states could build larger domestic markets. Both could support larger military establishments. Both could develop their own shipping and colonial networks. The Dutch were still efficient, but the world around them was becoming more efficient too. That distinction would become decisive. For a while, Dutch capital compensated for Dutch size. If the Republic could not field as many soldiers as France, it could finance allies. If it lacked certain resources, it could buy them. If it lacked a huge domestic market, it could serve foreign markets. This worked remarkably well. But borrowing and finance have a hidden condition. Someone has to keep paying, and war kept getting more expensive. The Dutch Republic developed an enormous public debt capacity. That was one of its strengths. Its government could borrow because creditors trusted the fiscal system. Taxes and excise duties supported debt service. Commercial wealth supported taxation, and confidence made borrowing cheaper. This produced a powerful feedback loop. Good finances allowed the Republic to borrow. Borrowing allowed it to fight. Military power protected trade. Trade generated wealth. Wealth supported taxes and credit. But the same mechanism could work in reverse. If trade weakened, fiscal pressure increased. If military threats increased, borrowing increased. If borrowing increased faster, than the underlying economy, the burden became heavier. And now the Dutch faced a problem they could not solve simply by becoming better merchants. Their rivals were becoming better states. The transformation was especially important in England. The English did not merely imitate Dutch shipping. They built institutions capable of mobilizing a much larger population and resource base. After the Glorious Revolution of 1688, the Dutch stadtholder William III became King of England jointly with Mary II. The political relationship between the two countries became extraordinarily close. Dutch financial expertise influenced England, but this created a strange historical irony. Some of the institutional advantages that had made the Dutch Republic powerful could now operate inside a much larger state. England could combine commercial finance with a growing population, a large domestic market, expanding naval power, and a rapidly developing imperial system. The Dutch had helped demonstrate what financial and commercial institutions could accomplish. Britain eventually demonstrated what happened when similar mechanisms were combined with much greater scale. That is one reason the Dutch decline should not be described as a sudden collapse. The old picture is tempting, golden age, then decline. But the reality was slower. The Republic remained wealthy. Amsterdam remained an important financial center. Dutch investors remained active. Dutch commerce did not simply disappear. What changed was relative position. Other economies grew faster. Competitors captured trade. Dutch dominance weakened. The world did not suddenly stop buying Dutch goods. It increasingly had alternatives. This is one of the most important distinctions in economic history. Decline does not always mean becoming poor. Sometimes it means everyone else is catching up faster. And there was another problem. The Dutch had become extraordinarily successful at finance, but financial success can change investment incentives. By the 18th century, wealthy Dutch investors increasingly placed capital abroad. Foreign government debt could provide attractive returns. Lending money to other states could be less demanding than building a new manufacturing sector at home. The Republic remained a financial powerhouse, but its economy became increasingly dependent on returns from an international financial position at precisely the moment when other countries were developing their own productive and commercial capacities. This does not mean Dutch investors simply became lazy. That would be a caricature. They were responding rationally to incentives. If lending to a foreign government offered an attractive return with less risk than building a factory, the investment decision made sense. But millions of individual rational decisions can produce a structural problem. Capital can become abundant in one place while productive growth shifts elsewhere. And that is exactly what makes the Dutch story so relevant. Economic systems are not controlled by a single person. They emerge from incentives. The Dutch merchant economy had been built around an extraordinary ability to move goods and capital. Eventually, more of the world's goods and capital could move without needing Dutch intermediaries. That was the threat. The Dutch advantage was becoming less exclusive. There was another hidden weakness, the VOC itself. The company remained one of the great commercial institutions of the early modern world. But maintaining overseas monopolies was expensive. The company needed ships, fortifications, soldiers, administrators, factories and trading posts, and political influence. The original promise of monopoly was simple: control supply, limit competition, protect prices, generate profits. But monopolies require enforcement, and enforcement costs money. The farther the company expanded, the more complicated its system became. By the 18th century, the VOC faced growing difficulties. Competition increased. Administrative problems multiplied, costs rose, profit margins weakened in parts of the Asian trade, and corruption and financial mismanagement became serious problems.